The first thing they teach you is simple. The sky does not forgive. Not fear, not hesitation, not the smallest mistake. At 10,000 meters, when your transport cuts through the thin air of a hostile world and the land below waits like an open grave, you learn that mercy belongs to the ground. Up there is only speed, altitude, and the sound that comes just before death. There is a kind of silence that exists only at that height. It is not the absence of noise. It is expectation. It is the breath held before the engine starts screaming, before flak climbs to meet you, before a missile finds its mark and turns metal and flesh into fire. My name is Kale Marrow, and I fly a Valkyrie with the 4th Transport Wing of the Astrum Militarum. For 8 years I have climbed into the pilot seat of that machine. For 8 years I have watched the sky turn from ally to execution ground, a place where every sortie can be the last. In those years I have seen hundreds of transports shot down. I have watched them fall in flames. I have watched their cargo, living men and women of the Emperor, become burning rain long before they ever reach the ground. When most people imagine war in the 41st millennium, they think of charging infantry, roaring tanks, space marines smashing through enemy lines. They do not think of the crews who get those soldiers to the battlefield. They do not think of the pilots who must cross skies turned into minefields of tracer fire, plasma bursts, and guided missiles. We are the invisible hand that moves the pieces across the board of war. And we die quietly, high above the glory of ground combat. A Valkyrie is not just a transport. For those of us who spend more time in its cockpit than on solid ground, it becomes an extension of the body, an extension of will. Every bolt, every rivet, every hydraulic piston becomes as familiar as your own fingers. We know her moods. We know her weak points. We know where the armor is thinner, where a system tends to fail under strain, where a hard landing yesterday might become a coffin tomorrow. Picture a machine about 20 meters long with a wingspan close to 15, built to carry a dozen fully equipped guardsmen inside its armored belly. 2 powerful turbojet engines howl along the sides of the fuselage and give enough thrust for vertical takeoff and landing. The nose carries a heavy bolter, which we pretend is protection, though against real anti-air systems it feels more like spitting into a storm. Inside, the cockpit is pure function. 2 seats, pilot and navigator, squeezed into a cage of instrument panels, control levers, switches, and cogitator screens. Rough metal everywhere. No comfort. No beauty. The Imperium does not waste resources on convenience. It spends them on utility. The seats are hard, covered in synth leather that turns stiff with sweat and oil. The harness bites into your shoulders during violent maneuvers and leaves bruises that never quite heal before new ones replace them. The smell of a Valkyrie cockpit never leaves you. Machine oil, ozone from the electrical systems, metallic dust, air that has been recycled through filters so many times it feels dead when you breathe it. Over toxic worlds choked by chemicals or saturated with battlefield agents, the sweet taste of charcoal respirator filters creeps into the mix. The engines become a permanent roar that seeps into bone and settles there until you stop noticing where the machine ends and your own body begins. After a few years, most pilots start losing their hearing at certain frequencies. We learn to read lips. We learn hand signs for the moments when Vox communication dies. In the rare moments of stillness, when the engines are off and we are standing on the ground, the world feels wrong, empty, unreal. Silence presses harder than noise ever did. Every morning, if morning is the right word for being dragged awake 2 hours before dawn on another world forgotten by the Emperor, begins with ritual. We pilots walk out to our machines in the dark before sunrise. The first thing we do is place a hand on the fuselage. It is not official. It is not part of any imperial manual, but all of us do it. The cold metal under the palm reminds you that the aircraft is still here, that it survived the last mission, that maybe it will survive the next. The pre-flight inspection takes about an hour. We circle the machine, studying every visible armor plate for dents, cracks, and impact scars. The tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus perform their own rites, chanting prayers to the machine, anointing critical components with sacred oils, muttering in binaric while incense curls around landing struts and engine housings. But we pilots trust our own eyes more than any litany. We check the hydraulic lines for leaks. We feel the wing joints. We make sure the landing gear did not bend on the last hard touchdown. The engines get the most attention. We listen to startup with the devotion other people reserve for sermons. A scrape, a knock, the wrong pitch in the rising whine of the turbines. Any of it can mean disaster waiting one sortie ahead. The turbines should spool smoothly, building from a rising shriek into the steady thunder of cruise power. Every vibration, every deviation gets reported to the tech priests, but the answer is usually the same. The machine's spirit is temperamental, but it serves. The Emperor will protect you in battle. That promise is all most of us have left. We fly aircraft that should have been scrapped years ago. Spare parts arrive months late if they arrive at all. One Valkyrie flies sortie after sortie without the overhaul it desperately needs because the front cannot wait. The needs of the war always exceed the reach of supply. So we keep climbing into machines held together by prayer, patchwork, and stubbornness. Inside the cargo compartment, there is room for 12 guardsmen with full kit. Think of a metal box about 8 meters long and 3 wide, with folding seats lining both sides face to face. There are no windows. The soldiers ride in near darkness, lit only by dim red emergency lamps that turn their faces into masks of shadow and reflection. The temperature swings from freezing cold at high altitude to choking heat during low runs over desert worlds or volcanic wastelands. They sit with their lasguns hugged against their chests while their gear rattles at every bump of turbulence. Many close their eyes not to sleep, but to cut themselves off from the reality of flight. Some whisper prayers to the Emperor and work aquila beads through their fingers. Others check and recheck their weapons, a mechanical ritual that gives them the illusion of control. But all of them know the truth. Up there they are helpless. Their lives are in our hands, the hands of the pilots, and in the hands of war itself. The relationship between crew and cargo is strange and distant. We do not see their faces. We do not know their names. To us they are a load, a package, 12 bodies to be delivered to a set of coordinates. That distance is necessary. If we allowed ourselves to think of every soldier in the hold as a person, breathing, hoping, afraid, loved by someone somewhere across the endless breadth of the Imperium, we would not last. We would break the first time a transport packed with troops turned into a fireball in front of us. And yet there are moments, rare ones between missions, when we cross paths with guardsmen we carried to the front and later see alive. Then there is sometimes a look, a nod, a brief shared understanding. They know we risk our lives to bring them in. We know we are delivering them to hell. In that quiet recognition there is a kind of comradeship, unspoken but real. If ground war is armor and infantry grinding over every meter of land, air war is something else entirely. It is three-dimensional chess where every move may be the last and the enemy can come from anywhere. Above you, below you, out of cloud, out of sunlight. And unlike ground troops, we have no trenches to hide in. No armor thick enough to shrug off a direct hit from a serious anti-air battery. The Valkyrie is classified as armored, but that armor is meant for small arms and shrapnel, not for the weapons that truly rule the sky. A few centimeters of ferrosteel at the critical sections of the fuselage can stop lasgun shots and automatic fire. It can absorb fragments from a shell that bursts nearby. But against a surface-to-air missile, against the plasma blast of a flak emplacement, against laser batteries, that armor might as well be paper. The enemies of the Imperium bring every kind of air defense imaginable. Orcs, for all their crude brutality, build flak guns that vomit walls of shells into the air and turn the sky into a storm of iron and explosions. Their aim is terrible, but there is so much fire that accuracy stops mattering. Flying through orc flak is like walking through hail when every stone can kill you. The Eldari, with their elegant and murderous technology, are worse in another way. Their missiles move with impossible speed and twist through the air so sharply that evasion becomes almost meaningless. Their energy weapons strike with surgical precision, drilling through the fuselage before you even understand that you are under fire. Worst of all, they hide anti-air positions behind holographic fields, and you can fly straight into an ambush without knowing it until the last second. Chaos brings its own horror. Their anti-air batteries are often defiled Imperial systems or captured weapons warped by corruption and soaked in the powers of the warp. Worse than the guns are the things that are not guns at all. Entities that can manifest in midair and tear at a transport with claws and fangs, ripping through armor with the strength of nightmare-made flesh. I once saw a valkyrie falling from the sky with its fuselage not punched open by shells, but shredded by the talons of something that should never have existed in real space. The Tau, still young by galactic standards, make up for numbers with exquisite engineering. Their air defense systems combine range, accuracy, and firepower in compact mobile platforms. Their launchers track several targets at once. Their energy weapons give almost no warning before they fire. Flying through Tau-controlled airspace means constant maneuvering, constant changes in altitude, speed, and heading, and even then survival is never guaranteed. But often the deadliest threat to Imperial transports is not one enemy race or one heretical faction. It is the modern battlefield itself. Every front in the 41st millennium is layered with anti-air defenses, flak cannons, missile racks, energy batteries, hostile interceptors, all woven together into a system of destruction we have to cross just to deliver our cargo. A standard mission goes like this. We receive drop zone coordinates, usually behind enemy lines or at the edge of a front where ground forces are desperate for reinforcements or supplies. We get intelligence, often incomplete, often already out of date, about enemy air defenses. We plan a route that tries to avoid known threats while using terrain, weather, and any sliver of advantage we can find. Then we launch. The first phase is usually the safest. Take off from a forward airfield or from the decks of orbital transports. Climb to cruising altitude. Formation flight with other Valkyries. Sensors set to maximum range. Everyone tense, but not yet in the state of pure alarm that comes later. As we near the combat zone, the air changes. Vox traffic becomes more frequent, more clipped, more strained. Navigators start reporting sensor contacts, unidentified signals, possible threats. Squadron command adjusts headings, sometimes aborts the mission at the last possible moment when new reconnaissance reveals danger that makes passage impossible. Then we enter what we call the death zone, the airspace where enemy anti-air is active and hungry. The first signs are usually visual, tracer fire climbing from the ground in bright streaks. Then the shell bursts begin, black clouds of smoke hammering the air and kicking turbulence through the aircraft. The cockpit fills with warning tones, radar lock, incoming missile, laser designation. That is the moment when training and instinct take over and rational thought gets shoved aside. There is no time to analyze, no time to weigh possibilities. You act. Your hands move the controls. Your feet work the pedals. Your eyes split between the instruments and the sky. You throw the aircraft into evasive turns, dives, climbs, side slips. Anything to spoil the enemy aim. Anything to become difficult to hit. But physics is always against us. The Valkyrie is not a fighter. It was not built for dogfights or graceful aerobatics. It was built to haul men and equipment, to rise and land vertically, to be durable, not agile. When we force it into a hard turn, the machine resists. Its own mass fights back. Structural stress climbs toward critical levels. Metal groans. Warning lights bloom across the panel. And there is always the cargo. 12 soldiers in the hold, each of them close to 100 kilograms with full kit. Nearly a ton of extra weight shifting with every violent maneuver, pulling at the center of gravity. A hard turn can throw unsecured gear loose. It can slam soldiers into each other. We hear them over the intercom, muffled cries, impacts, sometimes retching when inexperienced guardsmen cannot handle the G-force and the nausea of aerial combat. but we cannot think about them in that moment. Our job is to survive the next 30 seconds, then the next minute, then somehow drag the aircraft to the landing zone. We dump flares, little bursts of pyrotechnic heat that fall away behind us and try to lure missiles off target. We throw electronic countermeasures at enemy radar and targeting systems. All of it buys seconds, perhaps a minute. Sometimes that is enough. Around us, the rest of the squadron fights its own private war. I have seen one Valkyrie blossom into white fire when a missile struck an engine. I have seen it spin down trailing black smoke, no parachutes, no escape pods, crew and soldiers inside already dead though their bodies had not reached the ground yet. The impact comes seconds later. Even from altitude, the explosion is obvious. Another loss. Another 20 names added to a list too long to read. And still we do not stop. We cannot. The mission continues. We have orders, coordinates, a time on target. The Imperium does not forgive failure and does not care for excuses. You deliver the cargo or you die trying. There is no third option. Sometimes we fly low, so low the ground feels close enough to touch, using folds in the terrain as cover. Nap of the Earth flight. We skim a few dozen meters above the surface, dodging hills, threading ravines, hiding behind tree lines or the shells of ruined buildings. This kind of flying demands total concentration and perfect coordination between pilot and navigator. The navigator reads the terrain ahead and calls out obstacles. The pilot reacts instantly, lifting the nose to clear power lines, banking to squeeze between shattered towers, trusting instinct and the voice in the second seat. The advantage is that long-range radar struggles to see us and distant flak batteries cannot get a clean line of fire. The cost is vulnerability. A single orc with a rocket launcher in the ruins can kill you before you even know he is there. I remember one sortie over an industrial world called Cinder Prime. We were running at 50 meters through colossal factory complexes whose chimneys rose around us like a forest of steel. The air was almost opaque with industrial smog. We were flying on instruments and instinct. Then a bridge support loomed out of the haze directly in front of us, and I had less than a second to react. I hauled back on the controls. The Valkyrie leapt almost straight upward, engines screaming at maximum thrust. We cleared the bridge by meters. In the hold, the soldiers were slammed into their harnesses by the sudden climb. When we leveled out, my navigator, a veteran named Oren Vale, simply looked at me and nodded. Nothing else needed to be said. There are also missions that demand altitude. Drops into zones surrounded by the enemy where the only way in is to fly high, above the reach of most anti-air systems, and then plunge almost vertically through a narrow window of safety. Those flights are bitterly cold. At 10 or 12,000 meters, the temperature falls far below freezing. The cockpit heating fights the cold and never quite wins. We fly wrapped in insulated jackets. Our breath turns to mist even inside the sealed cockpit. And yet there is a strange beauty at those heights. Stars visible in daylight, trembling in the thin atmosphere. The curve of the planet bending along the horizon. Cloud decks below you like a white sea hiding the war that rages under them. In moments like that, it is easy, dangerously easy, to forget where you are and why. Then the sensors chirp. Fast contacts rising from below. Long-range missiles, launched from the ground and climbing into the upper air to meet us. We begin evasive maneuvers, but at that height the air is so thin that control response changes. Wings and rudders lose authority. The machine answers sluggishly. We rely more on thrust vectoring, on engine nozzles that deflect exhaust to force the nose around. When a missile is coming, time changes shape. You see it on the display as a point collapsing the distance. 2 kilometers. 500 meters. The defense system dumps its last bank of flares. You throw the aircraft into a hard brake and pray to the Emperor that the missile chooses the lie instead of the truth. Sometimes it misses, it flashes by. The proximity sensor fails or the seeker chases heat that is not you. It keeps going until fuel runs out and it falls back toward the earth. Only then do you notice you have been holding your breath. Your hands shake on the controls. Adrenaline floods everything. But there is no time to celebrate. The drop zone is still ahead, and there are always more threats. Sometimes it does not miss. The impact is a deafening violence even through cockpit insulation. The aircraft convulses. Systems fail in a cascade. Alarms howl. If the hit lands in the wrong place, engine, fuel tanks, control lines, then the end comes quickly. The machine stops answering. The ground rushes up through the canopy, spinning, monstrous, inevitable. If the damage is not instantly fatal, if fragments punch through the fuselage and wreck secondary systems, if one engine dies but the other still breathes, then the real fight begins. We assess damage in flight, literally. The navigator shouts reports over the alarms. Hydraulics at 30%. Right engine overheating. Fuel leak in tank 2. I work with what remains. I feed more power into the surviving engine. I balance the aircraft with differential thrust and whatever aerodynamics I still have left. In the cargo hold, panic starts to spread. The soldiers can feel that something is wrong. The aircraft is no longer stable. Strange sounds come through the bulkheads. Smoke and hot metal seep into the compartment. Some start praying louder. Others check their parachutes, even though jumping from a damaged Valkyrie at low altitude is nearly suicide. We hear them over the intercom, but every fraction of concentration belongs to the machine. The decision whether to push on to the drop zone or attempt an emergency landing gets made in seconds. If the mission is critical, reinforcements for a besieged garrison, medicine for wounded men dying in a fortress hospital, we often push on and gamble with total failure. If the cargo matters less, or the damage is too severe, we search for any strip of relatively level ground under friendly control. Landing a damaged Valkyrie is a test of skill and of luck. Without full hydraulics, the landing gear may not deploy properly or may extend unevenly. With one engine out, the aircraft constantly tries to yaw toward the dead side. Every meter of descent demands correction. Every second is a wrestling match with a machine that no longer wants to listen. The touchdown is always brutal. The gear slams the surface. One strut may buckle. The aircraft heels over and skids sideways. Sparks spit from the belly. Metal screams against rock or ferrocrete. We hang in our harnesses while the straps carve bruises into our bodies. Then at last the machine stops, tilted, wrapped in dust and smoke. The silence after the engines die rings in your ears. First comes the check. I look across the cockpit. Is the navigator alive? Yes. He nods and starts pulling free of his restraints. The instruments are dead, power gone. I hit the intercom. Crew report status. Voices answer from the hold, shaken, frightened. Alive, bruises, maybe one broken bone, but alive. We drop the ramp. The soldiers stumble out into the light. Some of them vomit the instant they hit solid ground. I step out last and look back at what remains of my aircraft. A Valkyrie at the end looks like a wounded animal, fuselage torn by fragments, one engine blackened by fire, a wing bent at a wrong and ugly angle. She will not fly again. Another machine lost, another asset the Imperium cannot replace quickly. Later the tech priests will come and decide whether anything can be salvaged. If we are lucky, engines, avionics, weapons, whatever can still serve, will be stripped for the repair of other aircraft. If not, the wreck becomes scrap, cut apart, melted down, fed back into the endless hunger of war. That was the end of one of my old Valkyries. She had served me for 2 years and survived 43 combat sorties before finally giving up the sky. You do not love a machine in the way you love a person, but when you have trusted your life to the same aircraft again and again, losing it feels close enough. Transport crews in the astrum militarum form a closed little world, tied together by experiences few outsiders can understand. We are not space marines with engineered bodies and guaranteed glory. We are not officers on the ground leading troops into battle. We are not tank crews wrapped in armor plate and cannon fire. We are vulnerable mortal men and women flying machines that should not survive but somehow do for one more mission. In our wing there are around 150 pilots and navigators at any given time. The number never stays still. New arrivals come from training worlds in fresh uniforms, eyes bright with equal parts fear and ambition. Veterans leave. A few by rotation, many in wooden boxes, most with no bodies to bury at all, lost somewhere over an enemy world. The average service life of a Valkyrie pilot on an active front is around 18 months. That is not an official figure. The administratum dislikes numbers that damage morale, but we all know it anyway. We have seen enough friends disappear to do our own accounting. 18 months, about 200 sorties at a normal tempo. Some pilots do not survive 10. A very small number make it through 500 and keep going. I belong to that last category. 8 years of service. More than 600 combat sorties. To the younger crews, that makes me seem almost mythical, living proof that survival is possible. But I know the truth. Survival depends more on luck than on skill. Experience matters, knowing how to read threats, knowing when to maneuver, knowing how to squeeze every advantage from weather, terrain, and timing. All of that helps, but in the end luck decides more than any lesson from flight school. Being in the right patch of sky when a missile misses by a meter instead of striking home. Crossing a flat corridor during the few seconds when the enemy guns are reloading. Meeting an enemy gunner on the one day his aim is poor. Our barracks are long, low, prefabricated structures close to the flight line. Inside, the atmosphere hangs somewhere between military discipline and exhausted fatalism. Lockers, bunks, the smell of sweat, oil, recaf, and damp uniforms. There are no decorations beyond a few small things kept private. A pict of home tucked inside a locker. A saint token tied to a bunk frame. A pair of old flight gloves too worn to use and too important to throw away. There is no formal therapy in the Imperium. No place to take your trauma and set it down. So we build our own crude ways of coping. Dark humor, silence, routine. When someone does not come back, his bunk is stripped by evening. His kit is reassigned. His name vanishes from the duty board and is replaced. There is no ceremony unless he was important enough to have rank. The rest of us simply absorb the loss and keep moving because there is no alternative. When someone comes back from a terrible mission shaking with stress and adrenaline, the others might just sit nearby in silence, letting him know he is not alone. That is often all we have to offer. My closest companion is my navigator, Oren Vale. We have flown together for 5 years, which in our trade might as well be forever. Oren is 10 years older than I am, past 40, which makes him one of the oldest active crewmen in the wing. His face is carved by strain more than age, by bright suns and dim instrument glow. One of his eyes is a bionic implant, a replacement for the real one he lost in a crash 7 years before I met him. When he focuses on a display, the metal lens shines a faint red. Oren is not a talkative man. He can go an entire flight using barely 20 words, all of them reports, warnings, and coordinates. But when he speaks, people listen. He has a talent for reading the shape of danger a second before the sensors do. More than once his calm voice has saved us. Dive now. Hard left. Spoken without panic, spoken just before the threat became visible. Our partnership is built on absolute trust. When I am locked into flying, I know he is handling everything else. Navigation, sensors, communications, threat assessment. If he tells me to do something, I do it immediately and without argument because I know he has seen or calculated something there is no time to explain. Between missions, we rarely socialize in any warm or obvious way. That is not coldness, just a quiet agreement that work stays where it belongs. Both of us know each sortie can be the last, and emotional distance makes the possibility of loss slightly easier to bear. But some nights late, when most of the barracks are asleep, we sit over mugs of recaf and speak about things that are not war. Family. Worlds we once knew in quieter times. The lives we might have had after service, if such a thing still exists for men like us. Oren comes from an agri world called Greenhullo, a place of endless fields and calm rivers. Sometimes he describes the sunsets there, how the light turned the sky gold and rose, how flowering grain smelled in the wind. It is so far from the gray smoke-smeared skies of the war zones we live in that it sounds invented, like something from a child's tale. And yet I can see in his one real eye that it is true, a memory he guards the way other men guard relics. I come from Ironspire Tertius, one of the countless overpopulated industrial hive worlds of the Imperium. My childhood was spent in the Middle Hive, in a sector where my father worked in one of the endless factories stamping out components for the Imperial war machine. I saw the sky only rarely. It was hidden behind layers of upper hive architecture, bridges, balconies, exhaust towers, and hanging catwalks. The first time I went up during pilot training, the first time I saw open sky running clean to the horizon with nothing blocking it, it felt like revelation, almost like prayer. That feeling, that impossible vastness, is what made me fall in love with flying. Even now, despite all the danger, despite the death around us, there are moments in the air when I still feel that same fierce joy. Dawn flights, when the first sunlight breaks through cloud and turns the world below into sheets of fire. Moments when the aircraft answers perfectly, and I no longer feel like a man operating a machine, but part of something larger, a union of flesh and engine moving through 3 dimensions with a grace creatures bound to the ground can never fully understand. Those moments are rare, brief, but they sustain me. They remind me why I keep going into the sky, why I do not ask for a transfer to some ground duty I would probably be entitled to after all these years. Because for all the fear and all the loss, flying is the one thing that still makes me feel truly alive. The maintenance of our valkyries belongs to the Adeptus Mechanicus, the tech priests of the machine cult. They are strange beings, half flesh and half mechanism, their bodies so heavily altered that they look less like men than like an argument between steel and meat. They speak in binaric clicks and tonal bursts that sound more like machine communication than language. When they must address us directly, they do it through Vox synthesizers hidden under their hoods. Flat voices, emotionless, precise. Our relationship with them is complicated. We depend on them completely. Without their expertise, without their rights, the aircraft simply would not keep flying. But their methods often seem irrational to us, balanced on the edge between engineering and superstition. They treat machines not as mechanisms, but as living things with spirits that must be soothed by prayer and gifts of sacred oil. I have watched a tech priest spend hours chanting litanies over an engine that would not start instead of simply replacing the fuel injector that was obviously failing. And then, when the litany was complete, the engine started, roaring to life as if in answer to prayer. Maybe he adjusted something I did not see. Maybe faith really does touch the machine spirit. In the end, it hardly matters. The engine ran, and that was enough. The real problem is scarcity. There are never enough tech priests. Each one maintains dozens of machines, valkyries, chimeras, sentinels, generators, anything with moving parts in the vast machinery of the astrum militarum. They work without rest as much as even their augmented bodies allow. And still the result is delay. Maintenance gets postponed. Aircraft keep flying with faults that are judged non-critical, faults that might remain harmless for weeks or might become fatal in exactly the wrong moment. We pilots learn to live with these imperfections. A right engine that pulls a little weaker than the left, so you trim constantly to keep the nose straight. Hydraulics that respond sluggishly in extreme cold, so you start every maneuver a heartbeat earlier than you should have to. Most of the time the aircraft limps through. Sometimes the small flaw becomes catastrophe. I remember a pilot named Silas Crow, experienced, calm, one of the best in the wing. His machine had an intermittent fault in one of the fuel valves. The tech priests inspected it more than once, performed cleansing rites, declared that the machine spirit had been agitated but was now stable. Silas flew that aircraft for another month without incident. Then, during an ordinary transport run at medium altitude, the valve failed completely. Fuel sprayed into the hot engine compartment and ignited at once. The explosion tore the engine apart and took part of the wing with it. The Valkyrie lost control and rolled into an unrecoverable spin. Silas fought for her, but without that section of wing the aerodynamics were gone. The aircraft fell into forest and exploded on impact. There were no survivors, not the pilot, not the navigator, not the 8 soldiers in the hold. The investigation found that the valve had developed a microscopic crack that visual inspection could never have caught, a flaw widened over time by pressure and heat. Diagnostic equipment that might have found it existed, but it was not used regularly because there was never enough time or enough resources. The official verdict called it a mechanical failure. The machine spirit had been unsettled. Additional rites of appeasement would be performed on the remaining aircraft. We were furious, but we said nothing. Open criticism of the Mechanicus edged too close to heresy, and in the Imperium heresy is just another word for dying in public. That is the shape of service. The Imperium demands sacrifice, and all of us, pilots, soldiers, officers, are cogs in a system that grinds lives into continuation. I remember a mission on a world called Blackhaven, where Chaos cultists had encircled the last Imperial outpost. The garrison was on the edge of collapse and desperate for reinforcements. Our wing was ordered to deliver 3 full companies of fresh troops, around 300 soldiers, into the besieged fort. Intelligence showed the airspace over the target saturated with anti-air fire. The previous attempt had lost half the squadron before it ever reached the walls. Command still ruled the mission essential. When I climbed aboard that morning and watched the 12 guardsmen file into my hold, I felt like an executioner. They trusted me to bring them in alive, and I knew the odds were against us. We launched in darkness before dawn, 20 valkyries carrying flesh and blood toward a fortress that was already half a tomb. For the first 10 minutes the flight was quiet. Then we crossed into the enemy defense belt, and the night exploded. Tracer rounds painted red and green scars across the darkness. Shell bursts lit the undersides of the clouds in throbbing orange. I flew by instinct, hands moving faster than conscious thought. Orin called contacts, hard right, missile below, flak ahead. I threw the aircraft through every evasive pattern I knew while keeping enough control to avoid simply tearing the wings off. One by one, the squadron started to die. One Valkyrie took a direct hit to the cockpit and dropped like a stone. Another vanished in a blossom of fire when a missile found its fuel tank. Another clipped the wall during a final approach after its pilot overcorrected under fire. All of it happened so quickly it hardly felt real. Only later do the images separate and become individual nightmares. We made the drop, barely. The fort courtyard was already under bombardment when we came in. There was no time for elegance. The ramp dropped before the skids fully touched. The soldiers poured out, stumbling, sprinting, diving for cover while rounds snapped through the smoke. I held the engines at maximum thrust, ready to claw back into the air the instant the last boots left the compartment. When they did, I pulled power and the Valkyrie leapt upward like a frightened animal trying to escape a snare. The flight out was just as bad. We lost 3 more aircraft pulling clear of the target area. By the time the survivors reached base, 9 of the original 20 remained. 11 lost, 22 crewmen dead, more than 100 soldiers destroyed with the aircraft that carried them. The fort held at least for a little longer. Reinforcement bought time. In the Imperium that often counts as victory. Missions like that leave stains you cannot wash out. At first I dreamed in exact replay, the same failures, the same faces, the same bursts of fire. Later the dreams became more abstract but no less cruel. Endless falling through empty sky. Control levers that no longer respond. The feeling of helplessness. I wake drenched in sweat, heart hammering, hands reaching for controls that are not there. Some pilots break. I have seen it happen. The stress, the constant danger, the accumulated trauma, all of it piles up until a man can no longer carry the weight. It starts small, hands shaking a little more before a sortie, reaction time slipping, judgment errors in the air. Then comes the final failure. Sometimes the pilot dies because of those mistakes. Sometimes he simply refuses to climb into the aircraft again. In the Imperium, refusal is cowardice, dereliction, sometimes desertion. Punishment is quick and final. A commissar performs his duty, 1 shot, one body left as a warning to the rest. The Imperium has no language for psychological injury that excuses failure. But those of us who have watched friends fray and break know the truth. Every human being has a limit. Some reach it sooner, some later. Nobody is made of iron. Medals do not change that. I have a few. Campaign ribbons. Commendations for successful insertions under fire. They mean almost nothing to me now. Each one was bought with blood, some of it mine in sweat and fear and years ground off my life, much of it belonging to others who flew beside me and never came back. One night after a particularly bad mission, Oren said something to me that has never left. We were sitting in an empty barracks over mugs of recaf, too tired to sleep and too wired to do anything else. He looked at me with that red mechanical eye and said, "We are already dead, Kale. We just have not hit the ground yet." I asked him what he meant, though I already knew. He told me statistics do not lie. Sooner or later the luck runs out. Maybe next sortie, maybe next year, but it always runs out. We live on borrowed time. Every day we survive is a gift we did nothing to deserve. He was right. We all knew he was right, even if we did not say it aloud. Every transport pilot on an active front lives with the probability of his own death as a daily companion. That is not pessimism. It is arithmetic. And still we keep flying. Duty is part of it, of course. Service to the Emperor, protection of mankind. All the noble reasons we were fed from childhood. But if I am honest, painfully honest, I think the truth is simpler. We keep flying because we do not know how to stop. The cockpit has become our identity. The sky our prison and our home. Take that away and there is not much left of who we are. That thought came back to me during the biggest operation I ever flew. The target was a command nexus on a world called Draven Secunda. Intelligence said the route ran through the most concentrated anti-air zone seen on that front. Enemy, flak batteries layered with mobile missile systems and hostile interceptors. Projected losses, 60%. More than half of us expected not to return. When I came out of the briefing, Oren was beside me. We exchanged one look and did not bother wasting words. Both of us understood. This was the mission men talk about in low voices and secretly expect to be the one that finally takes them. Pre-flight happened in tense silence. I checked the aircraft more carefully than ever. Every panel, every system twice. The tech priests finished their rites and assured me the machine spirit was strong and ready for war. I wanted to believe them. The soldiers loaded next, 12 elite assault troops, veterans all, hard faces, professional faces, but I could still see the tension in their shoulders. They knew exactly where they were going and what the odds looked like. They boarded without hesitation anyway and strapped in. We launched before dawn, 30 Valkyries rising together into the dark, one of the largest transport operations I had ever seen. Thunderbolt and Lightning fighters slid into escort positions around us, their leaner shapes guarding our heavier procession. The flight to the insertion zone would take 40 minutes. The first 30 passed in relative calm over friendly lines. Soldiers in the trenches below waved up at us, hoping we carried reinforcements for them. Then we crossed the front, and the sky ahead began to flicker with explosions. Tracer fire rose from enemy positions and formed a glowing curtain. The squadron commander gave his final orders over the Vox, all elements disperse. Evasive action at pilot discretion. The Emperor protects. Oren started a countdown to the fire zone. 30 seconds, 20, 10. I tightened my grip on the controls, slowed my breathing, centered myself. We had trained for this. We had done it hundreds of times, and yet every entry feels like the first. Heart hammering. Blood full of acid and lightning, time stretching. "We are in," Oren said, voice flat and calm. The first shell burst off our left side and the shock wave knocked the Valkyrie right. I corrected, leveled, and another detonation bloomed behind us, closer. Tracers slashed past the canopy. I threw the aircraft into a series of unpredictable turns, refusing any pattern the gunners could lead. Around us the squadron began to disappear. One Valkyrie took a cockpit hit and simply died. Another exploded in midair when a missile ruptured its fuel cell. Our escorts tangled with enemy fighters overhead, but they could not shield us from the guns below. The alarms became one unbroken scream: radar lock, laser designation, missile inbound, multiple hostile contacts. I dumped every flare we had, pushed the jamming systems to maximum, dropped into a dive, then clawed back up. One missile missed, then another. The third did not. The impact shattered the world into noise and white light. The aircraft lurched. Systems failed in a red cascade. Warning lamps flooded the cockpit. I could barely hear Oren through the ringing in my skull, but his report cut through eventually. Right wing hit. Hydraulic loss. Fuel leak. Right engine overheating. I fought the controls. The Valkyrie wanted to roll right and bury its nose. I switched to manual override, using thrust imbalance and raw force to keep her barely stable. "Can we make the insertion zone?" I shouted. Oren checked the instruments, checked the map, calculated. "Maybe, if the engine holds 3 minutes. 3 minutes, on a good day that is nothing. In that sky it was an eternity. But the men in the hold had to reach the target. The mission was critical, so I made the choice. We go on." The next 3 minutes became a blur of reaction and pain. The aircraft grew harder to control with every second. The roll worsened. The engine started making sounds that belong in nightmares. Around us more Valkyries were falling, the sky clogged with smoke and debris. But we kept moving, meter by meter, second by second. Then the insertion zone appeared ahead, a cleared pad on a hilltop briefly seized by our forward elements. I started down, wrestling a machine that no longer wanted to fly. The ground rushed up too fast, but there was no chance to adjust. The landing was closer to a crash. The gear hit. One leg collapsed. The Valkyrie lurched and skidded sideways before finally stopping. But we were down, alive. "Dismount fast," I shouted through the intercom. The ramp dropped. The assault troops stormed out without hesitation, knowing every second counted. When the last one cleared, I looked at Oren. His face told me what I already knew: engine dead, fuel system compromised. This aircraft was not leaving again. There was no time to mourn it. If we stayed in place, we would be overrun or blown apart. We bilayed out of the cockpit, grabbed the emergency kit, last pistols, whatever basic supplies we could carry. Outside, the storm troopers were already setting a perimeter. Their sergeant ran over and gave us the only order that mattered: pilots with us. We need every gun. There are moments in war when rank and specialty stop mattering. I did not say I was a pilot, not infantry. There was no room for that. On that hill, every one of us was just another body that could bleed. The next few hours were ground combat, and ground combat always feels wrong after a life in the air. Ruined buildings. Rooms cleared one by one. Muzzle flashes in dark corridors. Me firing a las pistol at shapes I barely saw, relying on instinct and on the assault troops who knew far more than I did. Oren stayed close. We covered each other on foot the way we had in the cockpit. By midday, the command center was taken. Enemy resistance finally cracked. The mission was a success, if success is a word that can survive that kind of arithmetic. Of the 30 Valkyries that launched, fewer than 10 returned. More than 200 crew were gone. 70% losses. Evacuation came at dusk. The remaining transports made desperate runs to pull out surviving assault troops and stranded crew from the ground. Oren and I climbed aboard one of the last aircraft out and stood in the overcrowded hold gripping straps while the engines dragged us back into the darkening sky. The return flight passed in a kind of stunned silence. Everyone aboard was too exhausted, too emptied out, too broken open to speak. We just held on and prayed that this machine would at least get us home. When the ramp dropped at base and my boots touched solid ground again, something inside me gave way. Not dramatically. No tears. No outburst. Just a quiet inner knowledge that I had reached some invisible limit. Oren looked at me and I saw the same thing in him. We had survived, but something had been left behind over the sky of Draven Secunda. Maybe the last scraps of innocence. Maybe the last piece of the lie that our work could ever be clean, or simple, or morally intact. Maybe only the final thread that let us pretend we were still men and not machines carrying out a function. I am writing this now in the silence after that mission, recording it on a data slate that may never be read by anyone but me, and I keep thinking about the price of the sky, about what it means to fly in an age when the sky itself has become the deadliest battlefield of all. We are invisible heroes, perhaps, or invisible victims. Nobody writes sagas about us. Our names are not carved into the grand monuments of victory. When triumph comes, the glory belongs to infantry who took the ground, to tank crews who broke the line, to artillery batteries that opened the path. We are simply the ones who brought them there. But without us there are no victories. Without crews willing to cross lethal skies, reinforcements do not reach critical points in time. The wounded are not evacuated. Supplies do not reach the garrisons that are still somehow holding. We are the hidden link that binds the imperial war machine together, and we pay for that role with our lives. We do not die the clean, heroic deaths of propaganda. We do not shout beautiful final words full of loyalty to the emperor while banners wave around us. We die in burning aircraft falling out of the sky. Our screams are swallowed by engines and explosions. We die beside the soldiers we were supposed to protect, the men in the hold whose fate was knotted to ours. Sometimes the death is instant, a missile strike, a fuel flash, a cockpit erased in a burst of plasma. Sometimes it is slow, a damaged machine dragging itself through hostile sky while one system after another dies until the end becomes unavoidable. Enemy air defenses are so powerful that many transports truly do live only one mission. Not every aircraft is shot down the first time. The numbers are not that absolute, but the odds pile higher with every sortie. Maybe on the first mission you have a 90% chance to return. By the 10th, 70. By the 50th, perhaps half. By the 100th, you are either impossibly lucky or so seasoned that you have learned to read every threat before it fully appears. But even then, even for the most experienced among us, the sortie eventually comes that has no return leg. I think about the friends I have lost. Sila's Crow, whose aircraft exploded because of a cracked valve. Vera Maddox, shot down by a missile over Cinder Prime. Talon Rook, who went into the sea after an enemy fighter raked his wing with cannon fire. Lena Thorne, who struck a flock of avians at low altitude and lost both engines with no height left to recover. Dozens more whose names are beginning to blur even while their faces remain sharp, whose voices still echo in my ears. Each of them believed in something. The Imperium, the Emperor, the necessity of the work. Or maybe they believed only in each other, in the idea that their sacrifice would help someone else survive. Were they right? Did their deaths matter in the vast design of things? I want to believe they did. I want to believe that every successful insertion, every life saved, every critical shipment delivered contributes in some way to the survival of mankind against Xenos and heretics. That is what we are told. That is what we are expected to believe. But in the hours when sleep does not come and memory presses hardest, doubt arrives. The Imperium is too large. It spans millions of worlds and billions upon billions of lives. What does one life mean against that scale? What does one death mean? We are drops in an ocean of blood. Our work matters, but we are replaceable. When I fall, when Orin falls, new pilots will come from the training worlds and take our places. They will fly the same routes, face the same guns, lose the same friends. The machine will continue because it must. The alternative is defeat, extinction, mankind devoured by things that do not know mercy. And still we go on. Even knowing all this, even understanding exactly how expendable we are, we rise each morning. We walk to the aircraft. We climb back into the sky, not because we are heroes. Most of us do not feel heroic, not because we still believe all the propaganda. After enough years, cynicism becomes another organ in the body. We continue because this is what we know. Because surrender, Admitting defeat before the horrors of the universe is unacceptable. Because somewhere deep under the fear and the fatigue there is still a spark. Maybe not hope, maybe only stubbornness, maybe only refusal to let the enemies of the Imperium win without a fight, the determination to finish one more mission, save one more squad of soldiers, deliver one more piece of cargo that matters. There is nothing romantic about that, nothing inspiring. It is simply the reality of being a transport pilot in the 41st millennium. We know we will probably die in the sky, burned in falling aircraft or torn apart by enemy fire. We know our names will be forgotten and our sacrifices left unmarked. We know the Imperium we serve is cold and merciless, that it sees us less as people than as resources to be spent for an objective. And still, when the klaxon sounds and the order for another sortie comes down, we go. We strap in. We start the engines. We rise into the air because we are pilots. That is what we are. And as long as our hands can still close around the controls, as long as our eyes can still find a horizon through smoke and fire, we will keep flying. Do not look down. That is the first rule every pilot learns. When you are in the air, when shells burst around you and missiles scream past, do not look down at the ground rushing up to meet you. Keep your eyes on the objective, on the task, on the next second, on the next maneuver. Because the moment you look down, the moment you let fear take control, the moment you start thinking about the fall, you are already dead. So we do not look down. We look forward into the endless hostile sky, and we fly. If these words ever reach someone, wherever you are in the vast Imperium, remember the pilots. Remember the men and women who carry hope through a sky made for death. They do not ask for glory. They do not expect monuments. They ask for only one thing, that the sacrifice means something, that the cargo reaches its destination, that the souls inside the hold are not lost for nothing. And when you hear a Valkyrie overhead, engines roaring above the battlefield, remember that inside that machine is someone who chose to fly anyway, despite the odds, despite the fear, despite knowing that any mission may be the last. The Emperor protects, but sometimes his protection comes in the form of men and women who climb into the sky knowing they may never come back.